Okay, everybody. Now, if we come back, and I'll invite Mary back to the stage as well, um, and we can take some questions from the floor, and we'll do the same. We'll have our roving mics. So to start our conversation, is there anybody who would like to ask a question right now? Okay, table 1 and table 2.
Hi, I'm Dan. I'm just wondering, in relation to some of the international conventions and the Convention on Biological Diversity and things, are the worst polluting countries signed up to the international agreements on the environment and biodiversity and climate change? So the countries that are doing like the most damage, are they signed up to the treaties and the international agreements?
There are 196 countries that have signed up to the Convention on Biological Diversity. As far as I understand, the United States, for example, hasn't signed up. The issue of access to and benefits to genetic resources might be a factor for them. So they are a hugely significant country in terms of the global ecological footprint. But most countries on the planet, biodiverse countries, Brazil, Indonesia, all those, they are party to this convention, which is the key global framework. And as I mentioned in my presentation, for the European Union, the multilateral order is really important. So the EU, Ireland, and all the other countries in that framework do actually put a lot of work into trying to get good negotiating positions. So even before this next conference in Montreal, there will be a huge amount of preparatory discussion by the European countries to try and get an ambitious outcome. Translating that into action, as Liam presented in relation to meeting targets, is another debate, and everybody falls short on that. But you still need ambitious targets to drive the debate forward.
Sorry, Dan, we'll get a microphone to you.
If some of the larger polluters or countries that are doing a lot of polluting and are impacting biodiversity aren't signed up to these international agreements, are we, the rest of us, essentially kind of swimming against the current, or is that a bit defeatist?
You know, I think if we were to take that view, we wouldn't do anything, because if we say, well, the United States may be out of the Kyoto or the climate action program, should the rest of the world sort of follow suit? The lowest standard shouldn't define where we go. We need to actually act with ambition, and I think Europe in those debates does act with ambition. It may fall short in terms of delivery, and that should be the standard rather than saying another party. And of course, we keep the conversation with those other parts of the world. There are many good things in the United States, for example, on biodiversity. So it's not black and white in terms of a debate. So I don't know if that answers your question. My view is we need to be committed to this multilateral environmental biodiversity global order, but we need to translate that here in Ireland into something practical that delivers.
Thanks, Michal.
Thanks, Michal. Mary, did you want to come in on that as well?
Yes, and also linking back into the earlier query about targets and what basically is the point of signing up to them if we never meet them. And I think I'd switch what you were saying there about the, well, if these people are polluting, why do we bother? And go, that's precisely why we do sign up to targets. We sign up for practical reasons because we just have to. It's essential for our life and for the world. We sign up for legal reasons. And we also sign up essentially for peer pressure and to try and convince others to do it as well. And the Paris Agreement, actually linking into the climate change, was an exceptionally good example of that, where essentially the US and China and various others came together and basically went, well, if you do it, we'll do it, and we'll get everybody else involved. And previously, it had been very hard to get countries to commit. But the more that come together and commit, the harder it is for other countries not to. There'll always be exceptions, but we need just to do it.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Michal and Dan, for the question. Table 2.
Hi, my name is Louise. We were talking about this a long time, and What are we doing about it? And in simple terms, what's getting in the way?
Doing about biodiversity.
Not enough. No, I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, obviously there are a lot of different pieces of legislation. There's a lot of policy initiatives. I would argue, and I think it's come up in the conversation, that if we implemented the legislation that's on the books correctly, we would be in a far better place today. And then the question is, why doesn't it happen? In terms of the fact that Ireland signed up to a Habitats Directive 30 years ago, and yet it still, in my view, doesn't have proper management systems for the most important biodiversity assets that it has in the country. It doesn't have any serious progress on marine protected areas. And honestly, I think it basically boils down to political commitment, which wasn't translated into resources, human resources, financial resources. There used to be an organization in this country called DUCAS. DUCAS was a forerunner to the National Parks and Wildlife Service. They were sent out to do a job and they were hung out to dry. They basically were not given the capacity. I felt sorry for the rangers on the ground who had to deal with people without any real capacity to do their job. So if we're serious about it, we need to give the capacity to do the job. And it's a public good. I mean, the private sector has its role to play as well, but fundamentally this is a public service. And it's a service that applies to all the citizens. So I don't think there was a serious commitment or a program of work in a timely manner to deliver on commitments. And if you continue to do this, I mean, if, for example, the next conference in the Convention on Biological Diversity at the end of the year will come out with real ambition and targets. But if that's not translated into real programs of action involving civil society, then it won't happen. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it just wasn't taken seriously.
Thank you, Micheál. Thank you for that. I see another hand on table 12 and then lots more over here, so we'll see what we can get to on table 5 as well.
Hi, I'm Jean. Our question is there evidence to suggest that a cross-department committee would help improve Ireland's implementation issue? And then following on from that, what would this need to be successful?
If it's okay, I think Micheál will step up for this one.
Thank you very much. That's a good question. And I think that the evidence is there in two ways. One of them is where you can see that cross-departmental structures are working, and you can learn from that. And then the evidence of, in this case here, biodiversity, where there are not strong cross-departmental structures. And we've heard very clearly from Mary, but particularly I think from Micheál, in terms of our poor record in European legislation. When I was involved, he made reference, and Mary did, to National Parks and Wildlife, and we did a review of National Parks and Wildlife just a year ago, which was accepted by the government. One of the main recommendations there, and it'll be relevant to tomorrow's discussion because Andy Bleasdale is the senior scientist in National Parks and Wildlife, they can't do it on their own. They can't do it with all the other actors on the stage that Mary Dobbs showed working together. And there isn't a good structure for them to work together at the moment. I think that's a key point. So in the report for the review of National Parks and Wildlife, we recommended, Jane Stout and I, that there needs to be a strong cross-governmental structure. And to give an example of where, from my own experience, I worked in the EPA for 10 years in the area of water and in the Marine Institute, we can see that the same cast of characters, in other words, agriculture and marine and fisheries and so on, can work together much better on water policy in Ireland. And there are structures that are pretty effective. Okay, I'm not saying the water quality is as good as it should be. It isn't. But still, the programme of work, to use the phrase that Micheál O'Brien just worked now, is there in place with legislation behind it at a national level and structure. So there's a lead department working with other departments. So the people in the Department of Housing or Customs House call in the people from Agriculture or OPW and say, listen, what's happening here? What are you doing about this? At a national level, and then it happens regionally and it happens locally. That kind of structure, coordinating structures for water, there's something similar happening on climate, are not there at the moment yet for biodiversity. And they absolutely need to be. The nearest thing that we have to it is, Mary referred to the National Biodiversity Forum, for example, which Tasman Crow is chairman of. But Taz will tell you, like, there's, you know, 2 men and a dog, basically. You know, there's nothing. There's no structure at all. And so it doesn't have legal standing. It doesn't have staff. It doesn't have resources. It's a joke. Right? And so you have to be serious about having national structures. So I absolutely agree that cross-departmental, cross-agency structures with the programme of work backing up to try and come together to do what we're doing in biodiversity is needed. It doesn't exist and it makes sense.
Thank you, Micheál. Thank you, Jean. Now, I know there's lots of hands up, but there's a couple of tables who haven't asked any questions so far. So I'm going to actually go to 5, if that's okay. Thank you.
Hi, my name is John. Our question is, what would it take to enact the rights of nature to those of a person? And how would that change?
Sorry, what would it take to do what to rights of
What
nature?
it would take to enact the rights of nature to that of a person?
Thanks, John. Mary?
There are two sort of parts to that, and I'll go through maybe the human rights first, which is just a note, we have procedural environmental rights currently. So we have human rights that are procedural based. So we have the access to information, public participation and decision making. We also have complementary ones that are broader than the environment, such as due process and things like that. We don't have substantive environmental rights based in Ireland at the moment. The Supreme Court discussed this recently. They sort of mentioned that it was a possibility if the Constitution were amended, but it's not there currently. It's protected indirectly through a right to life. They are developing internationally, including potentially through the European Convention of Human Rights, and it may filter down eventually into Ireland. But that is a gap. So we have procedural but not substantive. So that's if we're saying about equating, just bear in mind the substantive ones for humans don't exist in Ireland currently, but up for discussion. For rights of nature, I mean, you can legislate for them, you can put them in a constitution, you can do them whatever way you want, basically. The normal thing you'd be thinking about, at least, would be to give them standing. So that was what happened in Spain during the week, was a court recognised standing for a lake. And that is a very common aspect that is reflected across rights of nature. But again, you can give them more substantive ones as well, essentially not to be harmed, not to be negatively impacted. Bear in mind for rights more generally, I was saying this with one table as I was wandering around, rights are not absolute usually. So the right to life is usually considered absolute for humans. If you're putting in rights of nature, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are absolute rights. So firstly, it depends, do you put them in legislation or constitution? Constitution at the top. Obviously, sorry. And then also whether you put in caveats, whether they can be limited by legislation or for other reasons of common good, for instance. But there are examples internationally. So you can also leave it to others to decide how to do. If you just want to say we should have rights of nature, we should have it where we recognise common good, the common heritage, the importance of the world, and go Gaia-esque and all this sort of stuff. If you think that's a good idea, then you can look into it further, or you can go and say, now over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mary, and thank you, John. And John, this is something that has been coming up in submissions so far, rights of nature and various perspectives on that. So it's likely something we'll have a talk on it in the coming weeks. And so, yeah, keep those questions coming. Unfortunately, we've hit the mark for coffee. I realise there's more questions to come, and we will have the plenary session first thing in the morning to take all of these questions. So do write them down. We're not avoiding them. We just don't have time for all the questions now. So we're going to take a 10-minute break, and we're coming back to talk to the NGOs who are working to conserve biodiversity. See you in 10 minutes.
Because they're going